What's up, y'all? Brandon with BC Talks here. The Blue Beetle movie comes out this weekend, and I am super excited. But I realize that a lot of y'all probably aren't familiar with the character Jaime Reyes, the Blue Beetle. Now, you might be surprised to hear that he actually has a connection to both Peacemaker, a character most recently popularized by the WWE star John Cena, and The Watchmen, the critically acclaimed DC series, which was later made into a popular movie. Sort of. There have actually been three Blue Beetles, and two of them actually weren't even originally created by DC. The Blue Beetle character has a very interesting history that spans all the way back to 1939, and we're going to break all that down in today's video. Before we get started, make sure you like the video and subscribe to the channel for more comic book and pop culture related talk. And make sure you check me out on Whatnot. I was recently made a verified seller on Whatnot. And if you use my link down in the description below the video, you'll get a percentage off your first purchase. And it doesn't just have to be with me. Whatever you collect, you can find on Whatnot. They've got comic books, sports cards, Pokemon cards, any sort of collectible. You can find it on Whatnot. And if you use the link down in the description, you'll get a percentage off your first purchase. But if you are interested in comic books, stay tuned to the channel to find out when I'll be starting my first show. I've got a lot of cool and interesting books that I am looking to sell here in the near future. So the first Blue Beetle was Dan Garrett, spelled with one T. He was a character created by Fox Comics in 1939. Dan Garrett was a police officer who would take a special vitamin to gain his powers. Now, he was a fairly popular character up until World War II, which after World War II, the superhero genre kind of fell off as a whole, as the crime and horror genre was on the rise, and Fox Comics pivoted accordingly. Now, unfortunately, in the mid 50s, due to Frederick Wertham's book, Seduction of the Innocent, and the following creation of the Comics Code Authority, which strictly regulated the material that comics could print, the crime and horror genre as a whole was gutted, and many smaller publishers who had made their living on the genre were forced out of business, Fox Comics being one of those. Because of this, Fox Comics sold the rights to Blue Beetle to another publisher, Charlton Comics, in the mid 50s. Charlton Comics would then go on to reprint older Fox Comics stories until 1964 when they reintroduced Blue Beetle with an updated name and a new backstory. This time he was Dan Garrett with two T's. Now, I'm not sure why they added an extra T onto his last name. Maybe the name Garrett with one T wasn't popular back in the 50s and they had to update it. I don't know. But regardless, Dan Garrett with two T's was a college professor who came upon an ancient Egyptian scarab known as Kajida that gave him his superpowers instead of popping vitamin pills like the first Dan Garrett with one T. Now, Dan Garrett unfortunately only lasted for as long as he had T's because a couple years later in 1964, Charlton Comics would reintroduce a new Blue Beetle in Captain Atom number 83, which was created by the great Steve Ditko, who you may or may not know as the less boisterous compatriot of Stan Lee, who together created some of the most iconic characters in comic books, such as Spider Man, Doctor Strange, and the iconic updated red and yellow design of Iron Man. So the second Blue Beetle, well, actually, he's the third Blue Beetle, but Dan Garrett with two T's is considered the same character as Dan Garrett with one T, even though he has a completely different backstory and, another T on his last name. They're both considered the same character, even though they have different ways to get their powers as well. But the second Blue Beetle is Ted Cord, who is a protege and student of the first Blue Beetle, the Dan Garrett with two T's. He is also a gifted athlete and a genius inventor as well. That kind of archetype that you see with a lot of heroes in the late Golden to early Silver Age. Now, Ted and Dan were doing an investigation and found out that Ted Cord's uncle Jarvis was creating an army of androids to take over the world. So Dan Garrett, the with two T's, Blue Beetle, suited up to go take him down, and unfortunately, he was killed in the battle and had to pass the mantle of Blue Beetle on to Ted. Now, interestingly, he wasn't able to pass the powers of the Scarab onto Ted, just the mantle of Blue Beetle. So Ted Cord didn't have the powers like Dan Garrett with two T's. Ted had an assortment of weapons and gadgets. He was kind of like Batman. He also had a little beetle copter thing that he would fly in on. It was very late golden, early silver age, very reminiscent of Batman. How he didn't have powers, he had a lot of gadgets, and he was in a Blue Beetle costume. Ted Kord's Blue Beetle didn't get a lot of love in Charlton Comics, though, as he was mostly a secondary character who featured in backup stories in Captain Atom number 83 to 86, and then later got his own title series that only spanned 5 issues, with a sixth one coming a few years later. Now, in the late 70s to early 80s, the comic book industry experienced a decline in sales as a whole due to distribution as well as several other issues in the industry. And because of this, Charlton Comics lost the license to a lot of its characters and would ultimately sell several of their more popular superhero characters to DC Comics for a mere $5,000 a character. Now, an interesting side note is that DC Comics had originally planned to give the newly acquired Charlton Comics characters to writer Alan Moore, who was creating the Watchmen series. Now, they decided against this because Alan Moore was creating a darker, more gritty storyline with the Watchmen series, and they didn't want the newly acquired characters they just paid for to be killed off, so they decided to not have them in the Watchmen series. So, Alan Moore decided to create new original characters that were analogs of the Charlton Comics characters that he didn't get to use. Dr. Manhattan was a stand in for Captain Atom. Rorschach was based on The Question. Night Owl was based on Blue Beetle. The Comedian was based on Peacemaker. Ozymandias was based on Thunderbolt, and Silk Spectre was based on Nightshade. Instead of introducing the newly acquired Charlton Comics characters in Alan Moore's Watchmen series, DC decided to introduce them in their Crisis on Infinite Earths event, specifically Crisis on Infinite Earths, issue number 6. Now, in short, DC Comics continuity, not unlike the current cinematic universe, was a jumbled mess of a bunch of different universes, which they called Earths, and that made it confusing for a lot of their readers to figure out which characters were where and who was interacting with who. So, in the mid 80s, they created an 11-part event called Crisis on Infinite Earths, which destroyed a lot of the other Earths and melded all of the different universes into one continuity. And in this event, they brought the newly acquired Charlton Comics characters such as Peacemaker, Judo Master, The Question, and of course, Blue Beetle into the main DC continuity. Ted Kord would be reintroduced as an industrialist and founder of Kord Industries, a multi-million dollar tech and development company. Later on in Dan Giffin's Justice League series, he would be paired with Booster Gold, and this would start the infamous and well known friendship between Booster Gold and Blue Beetle, which is how many people know the characters today. Later on in the 2005 Countdown to Infinite Crisis series, which is not related to the earlier Crisis on Infinite Earth series, anytime DC has a universe or continuity shaking event, they tend to call it a crisis. So this was a prequel to the Infinite Crisis series. Ted Kord was captured and ultimately killed by the villain Maxwell Lord. Also in this series, we find out that the mystical scarab, which gave Dan Garrett with two T's his powers, was believed by Ted to have been destroyed, but was actually in a temple in Egypt, which Ted then took to the wizard Shazam to keep. Later on in the Prelude series, Day of Vengeance, we would learn that the wizard Shazam was killed, and the scarab, along with shards of the Rock of Eternity, were scattered across the earth, and the scarab found its way to El Paso, Texas. Enter Jaime Reyes. In 2005's Infinite Crisis series, a young Mexican American man, Jaime Reyes, happens upon the scarab in El Paso, Texas, and takes it home with him. Now, unbeknownst to him, while he's sleeping, the scarab attaches itself to him, fuses with his spine and nervous system, and turns him into the third Blue Beetle. Now, the recently deceased Ted Core Blue Beetle's friend, Booster Gold, was tracking the scarab and comes to El Paso, Texas to retrieve it, but finds that it has attached itself to Jaime Reyes unwillingly. So, Booster Gold recruits Jaime Reyes to a team of characters led by Batman to defeat that series villain, Brother Eye. Jaime Reyes has a wide array of powers due to the scarab that's attached to him. The scarab gives him an impenetrable exoskeleton armor, gives him the ability to fly, superhuman durability and strength, and the metamorphic abilities to construct or create any sort of weapon or tool that he may need to use from the suit. The scarab also has its own personality known as Kajida, which, if you remember from before, was the name of Dan Garrett with two T's scarab, and it will often override Jaime Reyes' decisions if it feels there's a better course of action, which leads to Jaime Reyes and the scarab having this sort of love hate. Married couple sort of banter relationship between each other. They also later on we find out that Jaime Reyes' scarab is actually a creation of an alien race known as the Reach, who are universe civilization conquerors. They go around conquering different civilizations, and they are longtime enemies of the Guardians of the universe who created the Green Lantern Corps. Now, the Reach had sent the Scarab to Earth to attach itself to a host. Then they would take that host over and use it to conquer the Earth from within. Unfortunately for the Reach, the Scarab was interfered with due to the magical properties on Earth as well as its time with the wizard Shazam, so they weren't able to control the Scarab or Jaime Reyes. So then they go on this whole new mission to kind of infiltrate Earth as doers of goodwill from the skies, essentially. But that is another story that's actually done really well in the Young Justice animated series. If you've ever seen that series, Jaime Reyes was a pretty prominent character in later seasons of the series, and the whole invasion with the Reach is actually a big plot point of one of the seasons of the Young Justice series. So if you want to learn more about all that and Jaime Reyes, I would highly suggest you check that series out as it's done really well. And that is the history of the Blue Beetle over 8 decades. Three different comic publishers and several T's have led us to this weekend where we will see the third version of the Blue Beetle, Jaime Reyes, in theaters. The very first Latino character to be the lead of his own solo movie. I'm really excited, and James Gunn said before that although this is not a DCU movie, Jaime Reyes will be in the new DCU. So that makes me even more excited to see this movie because I really like the actor Xolo Maridueña, and I think that Jaime Reyes Blue Beetle is a really interesting character, and I'm really interested to see how he fits into the new DCU moving forward. But are you a part of the Blue Beetle Battalion? Are you interested in this movie at all? Are you gonna go see it? I think that it might start off a little bit rough, but word of mouth is gonna help it on, and there's not a lot of competition for it as well in the upcoming weeks. But let me know down in the comments below your thoughts on Blue Beetle, and if you've seen the movie, let me know your thoughts on the movie. Make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and check my link down in the description for a percentage off your next purchase at Whatnot. I will see y'all another day.